The rain drummed steadily against the glass windows of the cafe, blurring the world outside into a soft gray haze. Inside, warmth wrapped around the early morning customers, the scent of freshly brewed coffee thick in the air. A low hum of conversation filled the space, businessmen murmuring over laptops, friends laughing between bites of flaky croissants, baristas calling out orders with cheerful efficiency. David stepped inside, shaking droplets from his expensive coat. His shoes, polished to perfection, clicked against the pristine tile floor as he approached the counter. He had been in a rush, barely thinking about anything except the series of meetings that lined up his day. "1 black coffee," he said, barely glancing up. The barista nodded, punching in the order. "That'll be $4.50. David reached into his pocket, fingers searching for his wallet. Empty. He frowned. His other pocket. Nothing. His heart skipped a beat as he patted the inside of his coat. Still nothing. His card. He had to have his card. His fingers moved quicker now, searching every possible place. He could feel the stares behind him, the growing impatience of the people in line. He let out a quiet curse under his breath. "Something wrong, sir?" the barista asked politely, but David could hear the slight edge in her voice. I don't have my wallet," he muttered, glancing around as if the answer might appear somewhere. "I must have left it in the car." The barista gave a tight smile. Waiting. David clenched his jaw. He had never been in this position before. He was the one people moved aside for, the one with power, wealth, control. Yet here he was, standing at a counter, unable to pay for a simple cup of coffee. A shuffle of movement came from behind him. "I got it." The voice was rough, worn by time yet calm. David turned, his brows furrowing. A man stood there, his clothes tattered, an old coat wrapped tightly around his thin frame. His face was lined, his beard uneven, and his eyes were steady. He held out a few crumpled bills, his fingers calloused, his nails cracked. David stared, stunned. "Don't worry about it," the man, Joe, said. "Just coffee, right?" David hesitated. This had to be a joke. He looked around, half expecting someone to laugh, to point out the absurdity of a billionaire being offered money by a man who had nearly nothing. But no one said a word. The cafe seemed to hold its breath. The barista gave a small nod, taking the money. "All right, 1 black coffee." David felt something tighten in his chest, something foreign, something uncomfortable. He had spent his life calculating risks, measuring worth, ensuring that everything he did had a purpose. But this? Why would a homeless man give up what little he had? For him. He took the coffee as the barista slid it across the counter, but his hands felt heavier than they should have. Joe gave him a small nod, turning to leave. David found his voice just in time. "Wait." Joe paused. David stared at him, words failing. He had no idea that this moment, this small, insignificant moment, was about to change his life forever. Joe had once been a man people respected, a loving father, a devoted husband, a man who built something with his own 2 hands. He hadn't always been the man wrapped in an old coat, standing in the rain, counting crumpled bills just to buy a stranger a coffee. There was a time when he walked into places like this with confidence, his head held high, his presence known. Back then, Joe owned a small but successful auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. His hands were always stained with grease, his workdays long, but every evening, he came home to something that made all of it worthwhile. His wife, Sarah, and their little boy, Ethan. Ethan had just turned 6, the year everything started to crumble. Joe could still picture that birthday morning. The way Ethan's eyes had lit up at the toy race car, set Joe had saved up to buy. They had spent hours on the floor of their modest home, assembling the tracks, listening to the little car zip around corners. Sarah had stood in the doorway, smiling, her arms crossed as she shook her head at them. "You two are like kids," she had said, laughing softly. Joe had only grinned. Best way to be. He had never thought in that moment that life could turn so cruel. It started small. Just a few missed payments on the shop's rent. Business had slowed a little. Nothing major. Just a dip in customers. Then Sarah got sick. At first, they thought it was just exhaustion. She had always been the strong one, the steady one. But when the dizziness didn't stop, when the pain started creeping into her daily life, they went to the doctor. The diagnosis hit like a wrecking ball. Cancer. Joe's world tilted. The word didn't even feel real. He didn't have savings. Not the kind needed for something like this. He worked harder, took in more jobs, but the medical bills piled up faster than he could keep up. Then came the real blow. The insurance denied them. Some technicality buried deep in the fine print. He fought it. He spent nights on the phone trying to argue, to plead. But it didn't matter. The debt grew. He took out loans, maxed out credit cards, but it was never enough. Sarah's condition worsened. He watched her fade. His wife, the love of his life, slipping through his fingers while he was powerless to stop it. Then the shop, his one source of stability, collapsed. Joe had taken out a final loan, gambling on one last effort to keep the doors open. But the bank came calling, and he couldn't pay. They took everything. His equipment, his space, his livelihood. Losing the shop was bad, but losing their home? That was worse. The eviction notice came like a death sentence. He had nowhere to go. He tried everything, friends, family, but no one could take them in. Joe still remembered the night he carried Sarah into the shelter, Ethan's little hand gripping his. The smell of bleach and stale air, the rows of cots, the hollow look in Sarah's eyes. It broke something inside him. She passed away just weeks later. Joe barely remembered the funeral. He was numb, floating through a world that had stripped him of everything. And then came the final, crushing blow. Ethan. Social services deemed Joe unfit to care for his son. No job, no home, no stability. They took him away. Joe had screamed, begged. He had fought with everything left in him. But in the end, it didn't matter. Ethan was placed in a foster home. Joe was left with nothing. Nothing but the streets, the cold, and the weight of everything he had lost. Now, as he stood in the cafe, offering a billionaire a coffee with the last of his money, he thought, not for the first time. I had everything, and now I don't even have $1. David sat in his car after leaving the cafe, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The rain drummed against the windshield, streaking down in chaotic patterns, much like the thoughts racing through his mind. He had built his life to avoid moments like this, moments of uncertainty, moments where the cracks in his perfect image showed. And yet, a homeless man had just shaken him more than any boardroom meeting, more than any failed deal, more than any betrayal in his business empire. Joe had nothing. And yet, Joe had something David couldn't define, something David had lost, or maybe never even had. From the outside, David Alexander was the definition of success. Billionaire, CEO, owner of multiple high-end real estate firms. A man whose name carried weight in every elite social circle. He lived in a penthouse overlooking the city skyline. He drove a custom-built luxury car. His watch alone could pay for an average person's yearly salary. Yet, as he sat there in silence, staring at the wet pavement outside, a hollow feeling settled in his chest. He was alone. And the worst part? He had been alone for so long, he barely noticed anymore. David's childhood had been nothing like his life now. He had grown up in a cramped apartment in a rundown neighborhood. His father had walked out when he was 7, leaving his mother to raise him and his younger sister, Julia, on a waitress's salary. Money was always tight. There were nights when dinner was a couple of slices of bread with peanut butter. Nights when his mother sat at the kitchen table staring at bills she couldn't pay. David hated that feeling, watching helplessly as his mother struggled. By the time he was 14, he had made himself a promise. He would never live like this. He would never be powerless. So he worked. Every spare moment was spent hustling, flipping used electronics, selling homework answers to kids at school, taking on odd jobs. By the time he graduated, he had saved enough to move out and start fresh. College wasn't an option. Too expensive. But real estate? That was something he could break into. And he did. He worked harder than anyone, learned the market inside and out, made connections, took risks. By 25, he had his first major deal. By 30, he was a millionaire. By 40, a billionaire. And yet, sitting in his car now, drenched in wealth and success, he felt like that same kid in the rundown apartment, watching his mother struggle, unable to do a damn thing about it, because despite everything he had built, he had lost something along the way. David had never questioned his beliefs before. Success was a simple formula. Hard work equals results. If you worked hard enough, smart enough, you would make it. That's what he had always told himself. That's what he had built his empire on. But Joe had worked hard too, hadn't he? And yet Joe lost everything. David clenched his jaw. He didn't like this feeling, this doubt creeping in. Joe's situation didn't fit his worldview. It challenged everything he believed in. And David wasn't sure he was ready for that. The cafe's warm air wrapped around David as he stood frozen, the damp chill of the rain still clinging to his clothes. The world around him seemed to blur. The murmuring voices of customers, the distant hum of the espresso machine, the soft clinking of spoons against porcelain cups. Joe stood before him, holding out a crumpled $5 bill, his fingers rough and weathered. His face, lined with the weight of years and hardship, held no expectation, no smugness, just a quiet kindness that unsettled David more than he cared to admit. David stared at the money as if it were a foreign object. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice low. Joe simply shrugged. "I know." The barista, a young woman with a tired smile, cleared her throat, waiting. The cafe had grown quieter, people stealing glances at the odd exchange. A billionaire unable to pay for his coffee. A homeless man stepping in to cover him. It was absurd. David clenched his jaw. He hated feeling vulnerable. He hated that he had let himself get into this situation. But more than that, he hated the way Joe looked at him. Like he wasn't judging. Like he saw something beyond the expensive suit and the momentary lapse of power. With a tight nod, David accepted the money and handed it to the barista. The transaction was over. He could leave. And yet, he didn't. Joe turned, ready to go back outside, but something in David stopped him. "Wait." Joe glanced back, raising an eyebrow. David hesitated. What was he doing? Everything in him screamed to walk out, to leave this strange moment behind, to return to the world he knew. But something about Joe's quiet generosity gnawed at him. "Let me buy you a coffee," David said before he could think better of it. Joe chuckled, tucking his hands into his worn coat. "You don't have any money, remember?" David exhaled sharply through his nose, half a laugh, half frustration. He turned to the barista. "Can you just add another to the order? I'll come back and settle the bill later." She hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." David motioned to an empty table by the window. "Sit with me." Joe tilted his head, studying him. "You sure?" David wasn't, but he nodded anyway. They sat across from each other, the rain streaking down the window beside them, the city outside dull and gray. Joe cradled his coffee in both hands, warming them. He took a slow sip, sighing in quiet contentment. "Been a while since I had a real cup of coffee." David watched him, unsure what to say. He had spent years negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, commanding boardrooms, handling ruthless business competitors, and yet, sitting across from this man, he felt completely unprepared. "Why did you do it?" David finally asked. Joe looked up. "Do what?" "Pay for my coffee." Joe considered the question, then shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. David frowned. You don't have much. You shouldn't be spending it on someone like me. Joe chuckled. Someone like you? David gestured vaguely to himself. I mean, I'm not the one who needs it. Joe stirred his coffee with a small wooden stick. Money's not everything. David scoffed. Easy to say when you don't have any. Joe met his gaze, unbothered. You have plenty. Are you happy? The question landed like a punch to the gut. David stiffened, his fingers tightening around his cup. Joe just sipped his coffee, waiting. David wanted to brush it off, laugh, make some dismissive remark. But he didn't, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure of the answer. David shifted in his seat, fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic of his coffee cup. Across from him, Joe sat with a calmness that felt foreign to David, like he had nothing to prove, nothing to defend. It unsettled him. You really believe that? David asked, voice measured. Joe lifted an eyebrow. Believe what? That money comes and goes, but kindness is forever. Joe smiled, taking a slow sip of his coffee before answering. I don't just believe it. I know it. David exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That sounds nice and all, but kindness doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't put food on the table or keep a roof over your head. Joe nodded. You're right. It doesn't. David blinked, surprised at the agreement. So then, but, Joe interrupted, leaning forward slightly. Tell me something, David. When was the last time money made you feel truly happy? David opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to say, every day, that his wealth afforded him everything, a life of luxury, power, control. But did it? The past few years had been nothing but meetings, numbers, strategies. Maintaining wealth wasn't freedom. It was a full-time job. He worked more now than he ever had, and every step forward felt less like progress and more like running on a treadmill. Joe watched him, waiting. David took a sip of coffee to buy himself time, the bitter warmth grounding him. Happiness is subjective, he finally muttered. Joe chuckled. That's just a fancy way of avoiding the question. David frowned, but Joe's expression remained easygoing. Not mocking, not smug, just observant. David sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, I get what you're trying to say. And sure, maybe money isn't everything, but it gives you security. It gives you options. Joe nodded. It does. But what if success isn't about wealth, but about the people you help? David stared at him. Something about the words hit deeper than he expected. He had built an empire, earned a fortune, but who had he truly helped? The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. For the first time in years, David felt something stir inside him, a question he had never dared to ask himself. Joe could still remember the way his wife laughed, soft and warm, like a melody he never wanted to end. Even now, sitting across from David in a cafe that smelled of espresso and fresh pastries, he could almost hear it, like an echo from a life that felt more like a dream than a memory. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, letting himself go back, before the fall. It had been a small house, nothing fancy, but it was theirs. The walls were covered in crayon drawings, tiny fingerprints that he and his wife never had the heart to scrub away. Their daughter Emily had been a force of nature, curious, bold, always asking questions. She had his eyes and her mother's stubborn streak, a combination that both frustrated and filled him with pride. Mornings were chaotic in the best way. Breakfast would be rushed, Emily bouncing in her seat, her tiny hands clutching a spoon too big for her fingers as she chattered about everything and nothing. His wife Anna would roll her eyes at the mess he made flipping pancakes, and he'd pretend not to notice the way she stole sips of his coffee. He had been happy. No, more than that. He had been complete. Joe ran a small carpentry business. He wasn't rich, but he had enough. He took pride in his work, building things that lasted, things people depended on. He loved the smell of sawdust in the morning, the feel of wood smoothing under his hands. It was honest work, and it gave him purpose. Then Anna got sick. At first, they thought it was just exhaustion. Then the doctor's visits turned into hospital stays. Bills stacked higher and higher, and suddenly, their small savings were nothing more than numbers in a void. He had tried everything, worked extra hours, took on more projects, sold what little they had of value. But cancer doesn't wait. It doesn't care how hard you fight. He remembered the last time he held her hand, how frail it had become, how her once bright eyes dulled with pain. She had whispered to him then, voice barely more than a breath, "Take care of Emily." But how could he? When the funeral ended, he wasn't just burying his wife. He was burying the life they had built together. The downward spiral. Grief makes you careless, makes you desperate. He started missing work, drowning in sorrow. Clients moved on, bills didn't. The bank took the house, and with nowhere to go, social services stepped in. They told him it was temporary, that Emily would be placed in foster care just until he got back on his feet. But how do you stand again when the ground has been ripped from beneath you? He tried. Oh, how he tried. But no one hires a broken man who looks like he's carrying ghosts on his back. One night turned into a week turned into months. He slept in shelters when there was space, on the streets when there wasn't, and the world kept moving as if he had never existed. The weight of being invisible. People don't see the homeless. They walk past, eyes averted, conversations uninterrupted, as if looking too closely might make them catch whatever misfortune had infected his life. He learned to live with it, the hunger, the cold, the loneliness. But nothing hurt more than knowing Emily was out there, growing up without him. He still carried a picture of her, tucked safely in the pocket of his worn-out coat. That, at least, was something no one could take from him. Back in the cafe, Joe exhaled, coming back to the present. David was watching him, something in his expression softer than before. For the first time in years, Joe felt seen. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he wasn't entirely lost. David sat in silence, the weight of Joe's words settling deep into his chest. The usual hum of the cafe, clinking cups, murmured conversations, the distant rumble of rain against the windows, faded into the background. He found himself staring at Joe, at the man's weathered hands wrapped around the coffee cup, at the gentle yet unshaken expression on his face. Why did Joe, a man who had lost everything, exude a kind of peace that David himself had never known? David's life had always been measured by numbers, earnings, investments, profits. Success to him was defined by what could be accumulated. Yet, sitting across from Joe, he felt an unfamiliar, unsettling hollowness creeping in. For years, David had convinced himself that his relentless pursuit of wealth was justified. He had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way up from a childhood of struggle. He had sacrificed sleep, friendships, and love, all in the name of security, all to ensure he would never feel powerless again. But was he really secure? Joe's kindness had thrown a wrench into everything David believed. "Why did you do it?" David asked, his voice quieter than he expected. Joe looked at him, his expression unreadable at first. Then he simply shrugged. "Because you looked like you needed it." David let out a small, humorless laugh. "I'm a billionaire." Joe nodded. "And yet, you looked lost." The words hit David harder than he cared to admit. His mind raced through the years. Lavish parties, exclusive business meetings, luxury vacations. Yet, despite it all, something had always felt missing. He had ignored it, buried it beneath more work, more success. But now, staring at Joe, that void within him was undeniable. Joe had nothing, And yet he had given, not because he expected anything in return, but because he saw someone in need. When had David last done something like that? When had he last helped someone without calculating the benefit? A question surfaced in David's mind, one that unsettled him even more. What if success wasn't about how much you had, but about what you did with it? His whole life he had believed in meritocracy. Hard work equals success. Yet here was Joe, a man who had worked, who had loved, who had done everything right, and still lost it all. David swallowed, his fingers tightening around his untouched coffee cup. "I don't understand," he admitted finally. How do you keep going? After everything?" Joe's smile was sad but steady. "Because I choose to." David blinked. "You choose to?" Joe nodded. "I spent years being angry, bitter, thinking about what I lost, what was taken from me. But that kind of thinking, it eats you alive. So one day, I decided that I'd rather hold on to kindness than resentment." David exhaled, feeling as if something inside him had cracked open. Joe had no home, no money, no certainty about tomorrow. Yet, he had something David didn't, a kind of clarity, a kind of peace. And for the first time in a very long time, David felt something stir inside him. A desire, not for more wealth, not for another business deal, but for something he couldn't quite define yet. He just knew one thing. He wanted to help Joe. But how? David leaned forward, his elbows resting on the small cafe table. His mind was racing, still reeling from the weight of their conversation. The thought had been lingering in his mind since Joe had paid for his coffee. A man like Joe, wise, resilient, unbreakable in spirit, deserved more than life on the streets. It was an impulse, but one that felt right. "Come work for me," David said. Joe blinked, caught completely off guard. "What?" David nodded, already picturing it. "A job. At my company. I don't know what yet, but we'll figure something out. You shouldn't be out here." Joe's expression darkened, and his body tensed as if David had just insulted him. "I don't need charity," he said flatly. David wasn't surprised by the reaction, but he wasn't expecting the sharpness in Joe's tone. "It's not charity," David countered. "It's an opportunity." Joe shook his head, letting out a dry laugh. "That's what they all say." He took a sip of his coffee, then stared out the window. The rain had eased into a drizzle, leaving the streets glistening under the morning light. "I've heard it before, you know. People with good intentions, thinking they can fix me like I'm some broken project." David sat back, studying him. "That's not what I'm doing." Joe's eyes flicked back to him. "Then what are you doing?" David hesitated, struggling to put it into words. He exhaled. "I don't know yet. But I know you don't belong here. And I know you're more than the situation you're in." Joe chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "That's a nice thought, but thoughts don't change reality." David frowned. "But actions do." Silence stretched between them. Joe tapped his fingers against the coffee cup, thinking. David could see the battle in his eyes, the flicker of hope, the crushing weight of self-doubt. "I've been out here too long," Joe muttered. "I wouldn't know where to start." David leaned forward again. "Then let me help you start." Joe shook his head. "You don't get it, man. You think just because you throw me a job, everything will go back to normal? I've been out of work for years. I don't even remember what it's like to have responsibility, to have people rely on me." His voice dropped. "What if I fail?" David studied him, sensing the deeper fear beneath the words. Joe wasn't just afraid of failing at a job. He was afraid of failing himself. Afraid of believing in something again, only to lose it all once more. David exhaled slowly. "What if you don't?" Joe looked at him sharply. What if you succeed? David pressed. What if this is your chance to get back on your feet? Joe was silent, staring at the table. David let the moment linger before speaking again, his tone softer now. Look, I won't force you into anything. I see something in you, Joe. Something I think you've forgotten about yourself. You were a business owner, a husband, a father. He hesitated. You are more than your worst days. Joe swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. David could tell he was struggling. Part of him wanted to believe, wanted to take the chance. But the other part, the part that had been beaten down by life, wouldn't let him. Joe looked away. I need to think. David nodded. Fair enough. But he wasn't giving up. Not yet. Joe stepped into the towering glass building, his breath hitching slightly as he took in the sight before him. The air inside was different. Crisp, cold, filled with purpose. Employees walked briskly across the marble floor, their expensive shoes clicking rhythmically. Everyone looked busy, focused, like they belonged. Joe didn't feel like he belonged. His clothes, though freshly laundered, still felt out of place here. His shoes, worn secondhand sneakers, squeaked slightly with every step. The security guard at the entrance had given him a once-over, his expression unreadable, but carrying a trace of skepticism. David had assured him that everything was taken care of, but that didn't stop the stares. Some were subtle, just brief glances before people turned back to their work. Others weren't. A few employees paused mid-step, whispering to one another. Joe kept his head down, following the woman leading him to his new workspace. This will be your desk, she said in a polite but distant tone, gesturing toward a cubicle near the back of the open plan office. David mentioned that you'll be assisting with logistics. For now, just familiarize yourself with the system. She handed him a thick manual before walking off. No welcome, no words of encouragement. Joe let out a slow breath and sat down. The chair was softer than he expected. The desk was spotless, the computer screen blinking, waiting for him to log in. He hesitated. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but his mind raced with doubts. What was he doing here? He was a man who once ran his own business, a man who made decisions, hired employees, signed paychecks. Now, he was the one being taught the basics. The whispers in the office weren't just paranoia. He could feel the judgment, the silent questions. Why is he here? Did David just hand him this job out of pity? Does he even know what he's doing? Joe clenched his fists. He had promised himself that if he took this job, he would earn it. But now, sitting here, staring at a screen he didn't know how to navigate, he felt small. Maybe they were right. Maybe he didn't belong here. Hours passed, but Joe barely got anything done. The software was confusing, the workflow different from anything he had ever used before. His eyes strained against the endless pages of instructions. Lunch hour came and went, but Joe stayed at his desk. He wasn't sure if it was because he wanted to prove something or because he was too nervous to walk into the break room. By mid-afternoon, the tension in his chest had built to an unbearable level. He had to get something right. Just one thing. His chance came when an email popped up on his screen. A request from a supervisor. Simple enough. He needed to log an order in the system. Joe sat up, heart pounding. All right, you can do this. He followed the steps carefully, entering the order details. He checked them twice just to be sure. Then, with a deep breath, he hit submit. A red error message flashed across the screen. Joe frowned. He had followed the instructions exactly. He tried again. Error. Panic crept up his spine. He glanced around. Should he ask someone? Number. He could already hear the whispers. He didn't need to give them more reason to doubt him. Maybe it was a small mistake. Maybe he could fix it. He tried one more time, tweaking a few details. This time the system accepted it. Relief flooded through him. He did it. He did it. But that relief was short-lived. Minutes later, an email notification popped up. Urgent. Incorrect order logged. Owi's stomach dropped. His mistake had affected a major client's order. He stared at the screen, his pulse hammering. A moment later, the woman who had shown him to his desk appeared at his cubicle, arms crossed. "Joe, can I see you in the conference room?" This was it. He had lasted less than a day, and now he was about to lose the job David had given him. Joe sat in the conference room, his hands resting on the smooth wooden table. He felt the weight of failure pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. The mistake he made wasn't small. It had affected a major client, disrupted orders, and now he was sitting here, waiting for the inevitable, his dismissal. The door opened, and to Joe's surprise, it wasn't the supervisor or an HR rep. It was David. Joe braced himself. David took a seat across from him, resting his elbows on the table. He didn't look angry. Instead, he looked thoughtful, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "You messed up," David said, his voice calm but firm. Joe looked down. "Yeah, I know." Silence stretched between them before David leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Joe, when was the last time someone actually gave you a chance?" Joe blinked, caught off guard by the question. He opened his mouth, but no words came. David sighed. "I figured." He glanced at the mistake report sitting between them. "You know, when I first started my business, I lost more money in my first 6 months than I care to admit." Joe frowned. "But you're rich?" David chuckled dryly. "Now, maybe. But back then, I was barely keeping my head above water. I made mistake after mistake. The only reason I didn't end up losing everything was because I had people who believed in me. People who gave me the space to fail and learn." Joe swallowed hard, his throat tight. David tapped the paper lightly. "You made a mistake, but the only real failure is walking away before you've had the chance to grow." Joe looked up slowly, meeting David's gaze. "You're not firing me?" David shook his head. "Not unless you fire yourself." Something shifted inside Joe. For so long, he had lived in survival mode, expecting the worst. But here was a man who actually saw something in him, someone who wasn't ready to throw him away like the rest of the world had. David stood. "Come on, let's fix this together." Over the next few weeks, David took a more active role in Joe's development. At first, it was overwhelming. Joe wasn't used to having someone invest in him. He expected David to lose patience, to eventually decide he wasn't worth the effort. But that moment never came. Instead, David guided him, sometimes with firm instructions, sometimes with humor. When Joe made another mistake, David didn't scold him. Instead, he walked him through what went wrong and how to fix it. "You're overthinking," David said one afternoon, watching Joe struggle through a logistics order. "Just focus on one step at a time." Joe exhaled and tried again. This time, he got it right. Little by little, his confidence grew. He started walking into the office with his head held higher. He still heard the whispers, still caught the judgmental glances, but they didn't weigh him down as much, because now he had something stronger than fear. He had belief. Not just David's belief in him, but slowly, his own belief in himself. Joe's transformation didn't happen overnight. It was slow, steady, and filled with both triumphs and setbacks. At first, he still carried the weight of his past, his failures, his regrets, the haunting memories of the life he had lost. But every day at work, every small success, chipped away at the self-doubt that had shackled him for years. Employees who once eyed Joe with skepticism began to notice his dedication. He was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. He double-checked his work, asked questions, and never shied away from responsibility. One morning, as Joe was fixing an error in the inventory system, a younger employee named Mark approached him. Hey, Joe, Mark said hesitantly. I just wanted to say I respect what you're doing. Most people wouldn't have stuck around after what you went through. You work harder than half the people here. Joe looked up, genuinely taken aback. Thanks, kid. That means a lot. Mark hesitated before asking, how'd you do it? I mean, coming back from everything? Joe thought for a moment before answering. One step at a time. That's all you can do. Just take the next step. The conversation stuck with him. It was the first time in years that someone had looked at him with admiration instead of pity. Joe became more disciplined with his earnings, putting aside whatever he could. He no longer lived in survival mode. He was building something. One evening, as he sat in his small rented room, he looked at his savings account balance. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a deposit on a modest apartment. With shaking hands, he made the call. A week later, Joe stepped into his own place. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't even a big apartment. But it was his. For the first time in years, he had a key to a home that was truly his own. He stood in the empty living room, the walls bare, the space silent except for his own breathing. And then, a tear slipped down his cheek. I made it, he whispered to himself. One day, as Joe walked home from work, he stopped at a cafe to grab a coffee. As he stood in line, he heard a familiar voice behind him. Excuse me, sorry, but are you Joe Carter? Joe turned around, his breath catching in his throat. It was her, his daughter. She was older now, taller, her features more defined. But those eyes, they were still the same ones that used to light up when he walked through the door after work. His heart pounded. Sophia? She nodded slowly, her own eyes glistening with emotion. I wasn't sure if it was really you, she admitted, voice shaking. I heard about what happened, and then I heard about how you turned things around. Joe swallowed, struggling to find words. I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a second. She smiled, tears spilling over. I know, Dad. Joe felt something in his chest loosen. Years of guilt, shame, and heartbreak melting away. In that moment, nothing else mattered. His daughter was proud of him. And for the first time in years, he was proud of himself too. Joe had walked this path before. The cold pavement beneath his feet, the distant hum of city life, the way people passed by without so much as a glance. He had lived in that silence, in the shadows where no one dared to look. But today, as he walked home from work, something made him stop. A young man sat hunched over on the sidewalk, shivering in the crisp evening air. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, his hands trembling as he clutched a cardboard sign that read, "Just need a second chance." Joe felt a lump rise in his throat. For a long moment, he stood there watching. The world moved around them, people walking past, cars rushing by. But this young man remained unseen, just as Joe had been. He reached into his pocket and felt the few bills he had. He could drop the money and walk away. That's what most people did. But that's not what had changed his life. Instead, Joe crouched down and sat beside the young man. The man looked up, startled. His eyes were filled with exhaustion and fear, as if he expected Joe to tell him to move along. Hey, Joe said gently. The young man hesitated before nodding. Hey. Joe glanced at the cardboard sign. A second chance, huh? The man let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Yeah, not sure I deserve one, though. Joe smiled. He had said the same thing once. I used to think that too. The young man frowned. You? You don't look like you've been out here. Joe chuckled. Not anymore, but I was. He leaned back against the brick wall, staring up at the city lights. I lost everything. My family, my home, my business. I thought I was done for. The young man's eyes flickered with something, recognition, maybe hope. What changed? He asked. Joe turned to look at him. his smile soft but certain. Someone sat down next to me. Instead of walking away, they gave me something more than money. The young man swallowed hard, looking away. I don't even know where to start. Joe reached into his pocket, but instead of pulling out cash, he pulled out a business card. Start here. The man stared at the card, then back at Joe. What is this? Joe smiled. A second chance. The man took the card with shaking fingers, staring at it like it was something sacred. Joe stood up, dusting off his pants. Money comes and goes, but kindness lasts forever. The words settled between them, just as they had once settled in Joe's heart. For the first time, the young man smiled. Not a big smile, not yet, but a start. And Joe walked away knowing that the cycle had continued. That maybe, just maybe, this young man would sit down for someone else one day.